It's time to sit back, relax, and listen to Conversations with Joan. Conversations with Joan will inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. And now, here's your host, Joan Herman.
Welcome to Conversations with Joan. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in. Conversations with Joan focuses on topics that are important to your life, from health and wellness to professional development to personal well-being. Changemakers join me to share their insights, tips, and strategies so you can thrive and live your best life now. Thank you for taking time for yourself, and thank you for letting us be a part of your life. Now, let's start talking. If you want to stop feeling alone, afraid, and stuck, then today's guest may have the answer for you. Joining me to discuss how we can learn to feel loved and connected is Dr. Dinorah Nieves, a behavioral scientist and personal development coach who is a consultant for OWN's Iyanla Fix My Life. Dr. Nieves has held counseling positions at the Torre Safe at Home Foundation and the Mary J. Blige Center. She specializes in helping people identify thoughts and behaviors that are keeping them stuck. She is here today to talk about her program that's designed to untangle limiting beliefs and fears. Dr. Nieves is the author of Love You, 12 Ways to Be Who You Love and Love Who You Are. Welcome, Dr. Nieves. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk.
Dinorah, I'm so happy to have you on the show because your work it's really about something that so many of us experience. And I want to go back a little bit in your life to when you were in your 20s. Like so many of us, you experienced toxic relationships, heartache, and struggle. How did those experiences shape the work that you do today?
They played a tremendous role in the work that I do. I think it was at that time in my life that I felt the most alone, even though I was surrounded by people who loved and cared for me. I just couldn't connect to myself, and I didn't feel supported by the universe at large, and everything seemed to be a struggle. And so all of those feelings, although I've had the opportunity to overcome the experiences, all of the feelings are things that still resonate with me. And when I encounter people who are experiencing the same emotional struggle, I almost transport back to those moments and know exactly what that feels like and why we're there and what might help. So it has played a tremendous role in the work that I do today.
So let's talk a little bit about why we're there. Why do you believe you and so many of us have those types of feelings?
Well, I think it's a multitude of reasons. I don't think there's one specific cause, but I do think that those reasons include a sort of social focus on other people, right? We're taught very early in life that we shouldn't be selfish, that we should be concerned with what other people are thinking and feeling, and people who strive to be good people, we completely and totally abide by that. I don't think that we're taught that we can do that and still put ourselves first, and still be a priority for ourselves, and still focus on ourselves. And so there's this idea that self-love and selflessness are mutually exclusive, right? That you can't be a good person who is connected to larger society and still be worried about who you are and how you grow. And so we choose. We either become the selfish, self-centered person, or we become the sort of other-focused person, and we never learn how to balance those two.
Dinorah, one of the things that I learned after going through trauma in my life was that we are a sum of the whole. I say the mind, body, soul, and spirit. We're not any one of those entities, but we're a sum of all of those. And your work is centered on what you call the 8 dimensions of wellness. So you're breaking it down even further. What are these areas? And let's just talk very briefly about each and why they're so important.
Yeah, absolutely. The 8 dimensions of wellness are emotional, financial, social, spiritual, occupational, physical, intellectual, and environmental. And when I was going through everything that I was going through, I was struggling in each of those areas, but I didn't have a conceptual framework, right? I would have never said to one of my homegirls on the phone, oh, I think I'm having a, financial dilemma or occupational crisis, or I'm in a spiritual, existential crisis, right? That wasn't how I spoke about it, but it certainly did fit. And as I started to get better, I realized that each of those dimensions offered me an opportunity to really focus on myself and develop my sense of well-being. And when I got my hands on that conceptual framework, it all seemed to make sense, right? So part of what I do in the book is give people really concrete examples of how they can be more focused and more developmental and self-improving in those areas, right? So each dimension has sort of tangible aspects to it. Emotional wellness is really about how you relate to yourself and how you center. So I talk to people about meditating and having healthy relationships. Financial wellness is not just really about, how you manage your money, but it's also about, do you believe in abundance? Do you go through the world believing that there's enough? What are your ideas about money, right? What controls your thinking and your habits? So each of those dimensions has some sort of tangible aspect of power in your life. And if you can explore it and deconstruct it and figure out how you got there and what you're doing in that area and how to get better, it really lays out a nice framework for you improving your sense of well-being.
Is it important that these areas be balanced?
Absolutely. And I talk a lot to clients about that because one of the things that I think people often do, and I'm at fault for this as well, is we end up being really good at one or two of them, and we sort of focus in the areas that we're really good, and then we ignore the other pieces of our life. So you'll see people who are really good at managing their money, but their emotional lives are not very well. Or you'll see people who are physically in shape, but spiritually they may not be aligned with what their purpose is or any sense of vulnerability or gratitude, right? So people will tend to focus on the things that are easier for them to grasp and ignore some of the other areas, but they're equally important.
Dinorah, earlier you mentioned the importance of self-love, that we practice self-love. And you also said that when we do, we often feel guilty for doing so. So what are some of the strategies that you write about in your book that can help us to practice self-love without guilt?
Well, I think that the first and foremost thing is first and foremost in the day, right? So I tell a lot of my clients, a lot of my friends, and I do this myself, is I take some time in the beginning of the day to just do things that make me happy. And that can be anything from watching a television show that helps me to relax, or it can be prayer and meditation, or it can be a yoga class, or it can even be journaling or writing all of my ideas about a project that I'm working on. So I sort of spanned there, right? I went from a physical activity to an emotional activity to a spiritual and physical together, right? You can do any mix of it, but really putting yourself first in the morning so that you are available to other people as a full version of who you are, and not sort of what I always said, what I say in my book and I say to a lot of people is I sort of was selling myself off for the parts, if you can imagine a car, right?
Right.
So that's what you want to do is really first and foremost, first thing in the day, get yourself centered, doing activities that help you to improve your wellness in any one or any number of those dimensions so that when you go out into the world, you're fully accessible to other people for all that you are in your entirety.
I remember when I was raising my family, anytime I did anything for myself, I did feel guilty. But what I quickly learned was that when my well ran dry, I didn't have anything left to give to other people. So it really is the greatest gift you can give others. It's not selfish at all.
Yeah, no, and the other thing that we often do is we hold people responsible for reciprocating the energy that we put into them, even if we've never requested it. And we hold them hostage to the energy that we've put into them. And it's unfortunate because oftentimes we don't even have the conversation. So we're pouring 80% of who we are into this relationship with another person, a spouse, a child, an employer. And then we are so resentful when we're not getting the same thing back, or we're not getting back enough to fill what we've emptied out. and it was never agreed to. So why, we're resentful that we're not getting something that we never bothered to ask for, and that frankly we could have given ourselves had we been more discriminating with the way we use our time and energy.
Dinorah, you say that we need to learn how to turn off mute so we can be heard. What does that mean?
Well, I think that has two meanings, and actually the more people I talk to, other people bring their meanings, so I'd love to hear what it means for you, too. The way it came about was really, as women of color, I was having a conversation with a very good friend who is a white woman, and she was on mute, and I and the other person on the phone couldn't hear her. And so she got back on the phone. She's like, I've been talking the whole time. And I'm like, that's kind of what it's like to be a woman of color. He's like, we've been talking the whole time, and no one has heard what we've said. So that was the way that the expression was born. And it was a little bit comical, and it was a little bit insightful at the same time. Then is how often we really turn off our inner voice. And so we go through the world, and we've been socialized to have a good sense of what other people want and need from us. And we determine what we're going to do and who we're going to be on the basis of what other people require. And that does serve us in some aspects, in some spaces, in some ways. But there's a real gift to being able to tap into your intuition and really being able to listen to who you are and what you need for yourself, and waking up in the morning and really paying attention to what that voice is telling you and being guided by something that's more internal. And so we've learned to mute that for so many years, and I think a big piece of the work we have to do is learning how to take that off of mute.
Well, you were asking what you thought it meant to me, and I lived that for much of my marriage, which ultimately ended in divorce. But I was talking and shouting and screaming to be heard, and I wasn't. And I kept it on mute. I totally understand that. I allowed it to continue until I turned off mute. And once I did, I ended up getting divorced. So I do understand that from both sides of what you described.
And so much of what you experience, and I've experienced that as well, is a big fear that keeps us in mute, right? Because most of us understand that we developed a lot of the relationships that we cherished under false pretense. We really did. It wasn't our intention, and we're more right to admit it most of the time, right? But a lot of the relationships we have in our lives we think would not continue if we really asked for what we needed, if we were to really say how we felt, if we were to really make some requirements, some requests, and some demands that really honored us. And so we keep a lot of those things to ourselves because we don't think the relationships will sustain it. And it's a big piece of the fear and the deterrence of being on mute or being letting go of it. And I think what you've identified is that there's a life after it, right?
Well,
that some of that...
There is, but what I was going to say is I do believe if I turn the mute off earlier in the 23-year period of the marriage, I don't think it would have had the same result. I think keeping that mute on for 23 years, when I finally turned it off, it was almost too much of a shock for my husband. So I think if I had taken it off earlier, we would have had a different outcome. Yeah,
possibly. That's the lovely, messy, wonderful, disgusting part of all of this, right? Is we don't know what we don't know,
Right.
And so as we're learning and as we're growing, there's so many things that we theorize and we think about, and maybe it would have been better and maybe not, and maybe there is a way to do it differently, and maybe it was done exactly as it needed to for it to give you what you needed to grow. So there are no lost lessons,
No, and in talking about self-love and having the confidence to turn off mute and to believe in ourselves, I think so much of the problem is that we doubt ourselves. We think so little of ourselves. And I'm not really sure where that comes from. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're right. I think we do think little of ourselves, and I think it's because there is an idea that thinking big of yourself makes you arrogant. And there is an idea that there is an honor to being humble in quotes. And the reason I say in quotes is because it's more of the common idea of humble, which is to be pious and to be sort of quiet and shy. I don't necessarily think of that as humility. I took this phenomenal spirituality class with a Hebrew rabbi. I'm not Jewish, by the way, but I just love spiritual teaching of any kind. And they talked about, in the class, humility as really seeing yourself as the most important thing in the world and the least significant thing in the world at the same time. That it really is about balance. And I talk about it in my book as really centering yourself, if you would think of yourself as a sort of a pendulum swinging, centering yourself somewhere between I have a lot to offer and I have a lot to learn. And I really think that's the key, is not seeing yourself as the biggest thing or seeing yourself as the smallest thing, or maybe seeing yourself as both, right? But really finding that in between that allows you to stand in the power of who you are and still be open to the power that's around you.
And that's important, to stand in the power of who you are. And I'm a believer that that inner power, a lot of it comes from the way that we talk to ourselves. Dinorah, we speak to ourselves in a way that we would never think of talking to another person. And, how do we go about changing that? What do you think we need to do to stop speaking to ourselves in such a self-hating way?
Yeah, catch the judgment. A lot of judgment is based on extremes, right and wrong, good and bad. And so what I tell my clients all the time, and what I've worked on for a very long time, is really starting to remove those things and not thinking of things as good or bad or right and wrong, but just thinking of who I want to become and how I want to work on that. And then looking at what I do, what I think, what I say, how I feel as either helpful towards that goal or not so much. And when I experience what I experience, I don't judge myself for experiencing it, right? I just sort of get a handle on what it is and where it came from and where it's going to take me, and then I make some choices about how to process it, manage it, let it out, and keep it moving. I think what keeps us stuck a lot of times is what you're talking about, that judgmental self-talk, where you're constantly criticizing yourself and you don't let yourself off the hook for things that you feel you could have done differently, and you don't let yourself off the hook for the goals that you feel you should have been at already, and the things you want to accomplish, and rather than them being dreams, they turn into torments, and it just becomes this crazy. I call it the Wizard of Oz tornado. It's like I see it with my clients, and I used to do this a lot myself. I'd get upset about one thing, and all of a sudden I'm picking up, and I was supposed to wash the sheets, and why didn't I, and it's now, I've picked up the dog and Dorothy and the whole freaking tornado. So I really think it's important for us to catch the self-talk. What do I say to myself? How did I just judge myself? Why am I judging myself? There is no right or wrong here. If there was no right or wrong, what more compassionate thing would I say to myself? And really start to change that in the moment.
And all of the negative things that we've experienced, it's so difficult to let go of them, but letting go is sometimes the best thing that we can do.
Yeah, letting go was hard for me. And so what I had to do in order to facilitate some letting go is recontextualize, right? So I started to say, if I do love myself, then everything about me is exactly as it's supposed to be. And if everything about me was created by everything that I've been through, then everything that I've been through was part of making me who I am, and it couldn't have been wrong because I'm awesome. And so I just had to give those things a different context. And when I was able to do that, then I was able to let go of some stuff, not because letting go was the goal anymore, but just because it wasn't worth holding on to.
Dinorah, what are some ways that you would recommend for us to build better, stronger, more meaningful relationships?
I think that the number one thing that I would say is important in building relationships is honesty. Because I think that we go into relationships oftentimes looking for who we want the other person to be and presenting who we want the other person to think we are. And there's some power in that, believe it or not, because I know a lot of people who love who they've become in the eyes of others, right? But there's also a lot of disempowerment in that, because it means that you are never fully satisfied with who you are or who another person is. And you don't fully see them, and they don't fully see you. And then it leads to disappointment, and it leads to broken agreements, and it leads to other complications that are not healthy. So I think honesty is really important, and vulnerability is a piece of that. You know, just being honest about where we're strong, where we struggle, what we need, what we want, what we can do, what we can't do. Really, really being transparent, I think, is an important piece of having a healthy relationship of any kind.
The one thing when you were talking about honesty that struck me, I remember after getting divorced, I did a healing program that was based on the 12 steps of AA. And one of the first ones was, accepting what you can't change. And I think a big mistake that we make is, as you said, we're always trying to change another person rather than accept that person for who he or she is. And you're right. I mean, that doesn't serve us well.
Yeah, and accepting somebody doesn't mean that you have no conversation about it. And that's the other thing. One of the hardest moments in my life ever is when I decided I needed to be honest with my parents about things that I have felt about them. And they were phenomenal parents, which makes it harder because the better people are to you, right? The more guilty you feel about pointing out anything that you ever even struggled with. But having those conversations, as hard as they may, transformed our relationships in such powerful ways. But really, I would have never even, had we had this conversation 10 years ago, I would have never said to you, you know what, Joan, I think I've been lying to my mama about how I feel about, A, B, or C. Little things, right? Like maybe I don't like when you cook rice every day. I actually do, so that's a bad example. But little things. We just don't even know how much we're holding inside. And I think that we think that not telling the truth about certain things because we don't want to hurt someone's feelings, or because we don't want to upset the dynamic, or because we're afraid we're going to lose them, we think that if we don't tell it, they don't feel it. And usually the truth is in the energy. And so then there's a disconnect between what you're admitting to and what you're emanating. And that'll bring all kinds of upset in even the best relationships.
The book is Love You, 12 Ways to Be Who You Love and Love Who You Are. If you'd like to get more information about Dinorah and her work, you can visit DinorahNieves.com. Dinorah, in our final moments, what's the takeaway? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
I want people to learn how to put their wellness first and make their well-being a priority, guilt-free and unapologetically, because you really cannot be a resource or a benefit to anyone else until you learn to build a solid foundation and relationship with yourself and inside of yourself. And then I think once you do that, you are just such an amazing light in every room that you walk into, in every space that you enter. And that is probably one of the best ways to be of service to this world.
Dinorah, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing in this conversation about self-love. As you said, self-love is a priority. We need to do it without guilt and without apology. So thank you so much for talking about your book and for sharing some strategies with us.
Thank you for having me, Joan. I love this conversation, and let's talk again.
This is Conversations with Joan. Stay with us. We'll be right back.